My name is Elise Gardner, and the instant my manager, Croft Brennan, told me my dying father wasn't his responsibility, it shattered everything I believed about who I was. I stood in that antiseptic break room, still dressed in my grimy uniform from the diner where I'd spent 3 years pouring coffee for people who barely noticed I existed, pleading with this man for 1 week off because my dad was taking his last breaths in room 247 of General Hospital. Croft didn't even lift his eyes from the schedule sheets when he muttered, "Find coverage or don't bother coming back. Your personal issues aren't my concern." His words slammed into me like a freight train, wrecking everything I thought I understood about basic human kindness. I'd worked every holiday, covered every sick shift, stayed late without protest, and this was how I was repaid. My father, the gentle man who'd raised me alone after my mother walked out when I was 7, was dying. And this creature wearing a bargain bin tie cared more about weekend lunch rush staffing than the fact my heart was splintering into pieces. Before I explain what happened next, I need you to take a few seconds and tell me if you've ever had someone dismiss the most meaningful moment of your life like it meant absolutely nothing. Because what I uncovered about my father and what I did to that manager will change the way you see revenge forever. You need to hear this story all the way to the end. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon because this gets so much more twisted than you can imagine. I walked out of that diner without another word. Croft's voice chased me through the kitchen, yelling about how I'd never work in this town again, how he'd make sure everyone knew I was unreliable. I drove straight to the hospital where my father lay hooked to machines that beeped with the slow rhythm of his fading life. Arlo Gardner had been my entire world since I was a child. He worked from home doing what he called number crunching for dull government projects. Always hunched over multiple computer screens in our tiny apartment, wearing the same 3 button-down shirts he'd owned for years. Dad passed away on a Tuesday morning while I held his worn hand. The nurse said he went peacefully, but peace felt impossible when my entire support system vanished in that sterile room. I spent the next 6 days arranging a funeral I couldn't afford, fielding calls from his few coworkers who seemed genuinely shocked by his death, and trying to figure out how someone earning $11.50 an hour was supposed to cover burial costs, rent, and basic living expenses. The funeral was modest. A handful of his colleagues attended along with Mrs. Patterson from next door, who always complained about our television being too loud. But there were also 3 men in expensive suits standing at the back of the chapel, never introducing themselves, just observing with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I approached them after the service, they merely nodded respectfully and left without a word. Returning to work the following Monday felt like stepping back into a nightmare I'd temporarily escaped. The diner looked the same, smelled the same, sounded the same. Croft stood behind the counter, that permanent sneer etched across his face as if he'd been born wearing it. The other waitresses, Penny and Rue, gave me sympathetic glances but kept their distance. Everyone knew what had happened, and everyone knew better than to cross Croft. I tied my apron around my waist and grabbed my order pad, expecting the usual morning rush of construction workers and office employees grabbing coffee before their real lives began. But something felt different. The kitchen staff kept glancing toward the front entrance, and Penny kept checking her phone with anxious expressions. Then I saw him. A man in a tailored navy suit stood by the host station, scanning the dining room with the precise focus of someone conducting surveillance. He wasn't here for pancakes or coffee. His presence commanded attention in a way that made conversations pause and customers turn in their chairs. When his gaze landed on me, recognition flashed across his features. Elise Gardner. His voice carried an authority that made my name feel important for the first time in years. I nodded, suddenly aware of how absurd I must look in my polyester uniform with its grease stains and frayed edges. "My name is Director Hayes with the Treasury Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk." The word struck me like lightning. Treasury Financial Crimes Division, Government Authority. The kind of serious business that had nothing to do with diner waitresses or people like me. Croft appeared beside us with that greasy smile he saved for customers he feared might complain to corporate. Is there a problem here? Because Elise just lost her father, and she's been a bit emotional lately. Director Hayes fixed Croft with a stare that could have frozen boiling water. Actually, there's no problem at all. Miss Gardner, could we speak privately? I slipped off my apron and followed him outside, leaving Croft standing there with his mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. We sat in his government sedan, and Director Hayes opened a briefcase containing documents with my father's name printed across the top in bold letters. Your father was one of our most valuable forensic accountants, he began, and I felt my understanding of reality start to crack. For 15 years, Arlo conducted covert audits of major corporations suspected of tax evasion. His work was so meticulous, so precise, that we built our entire prosecution strategy around his findings. I stared at the documents, seeing my father's name attached to case files involving millions of dollars. This quiet man who wore the same 3 shirts and ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day had been living a completely different life than the one I knew. The company you work for, Director Hayes continued, pointing toward the diner, was his final assignment. Hartwell Food Services has been systematically evading federal taxes for 8 years. Your father documented everything. Shell companies, offshore accounts, falsified employee records, tip theft, wage manipulation. The evidence he compiled could put the executives in federal prison for decades. My world twisted sideways. I'd been serving coffee to criminals who were stealing from their own workers, while my father secretly built the case that would destroy them. But here's our problem, Director Hayes said, his expression turning grim. Your father was paranoid about digital security. He encrypted all his findings and stored them in cryptocurrency wallets with access keys only he knew. We've searched his apartment, his computers, everything, and we can't find those keys anywhere. What does that mean? I asked. It means 8 years of evidence vanished the moment your father died. Unless, he studied my face closely, unless he left you some way to access those files. I thought about Dad's desk at home, still exactly as he'd left it. Stacks of notebooks filled with numbers and codes that looked like nonsense, USB drives labeled with dates and random letters, a safe hidden behind his bedroom dresser that I'd never opened because I didn't know the combination. He might have, I said slowly. Director Hayes leaned forward. Miss Gardner, those files contain evidence of tax evasion totaling $47 million. If we can recover them, your father's work will dismantle one of the largest corporate fraud schemes we've ever investigated. $47 million. The number felt unreal, unreachable, completely disconnected from my world of dollar tips and stale pastries. What happens if I find these files? I asked. Justice, he replied simply, and a substantial reward for your cooperation. I returned to work that afternoon, feeling like I was walking through someone else's life. Croft watched me with narrow, suspicious eyes, probably wondering why government agents were pulling his employees aside for private conversations. I poured coffee and took orders on autopilot while my thoughts spun through everything I thought I knew about my father. That evening, I sat in Dad's chair and truly examined his workspace for the first time. The notebooks weren't chaotic. They followed patterns, sequences, mathematical progressions that meant something to someone who understood the logic behind them. The USB drives were labeled with dates that matched specific entries in his handwritten notes. The safe combination took me 3 hours to solve. Dad always said I was the smartest person he knew, and apparently he'd hidden the answer in plain sight. His birthday, my birthday, and the day my mother walked out. Arranged in the order they shaped our life together. Inside the safe, I found a single envelope with my name written in his neat handwriting. The letter inside contained 24 alphanumeric sequences, each paired with a company name. Hartwell Food Services was number 17 on the list. The next morning, I dressed for work knowing everything was about to shift. But first, I needed to understand who I was really dealing with and how deep this conspiracy ran. I started noticing details I'd always overlooked. Croft's expensive watch despite the diner's supposedly failing finances. The way he handled cash tips that never made it into official records. The late-night meetings he held in the office with men who definitely weren't food suppliers. Penny mentioned her overtime hours never appeared on her pay stubs. Rue complained about health insurance deductions that never led to actual coverage. The kitchen staff worked split shifts to avoid full-time benefits, but somehow the schedules always guaranteed they were classified as part-time. I began documenting everything: shift schedules that violated labor laws, cash register readings that didn't match reported sales, customer counts that made no sense given the actual foot traffic. Every detail my father would have noticed if he'd been investigating this place. 3 weeks after the funeral, I'd gathered enough evidence to see the full scope of what Dad had been building. Hartwell Food Services wasn't just dodging taxes. They were systematically robbing every employee who worked for them while creating fraudulent records that made the entire operation look legitimate. But I realized something else too. I didn't have to hand over this evidence to the government right away. I had other options. Late one night, I researched Hartwell's main competitor, a company called Summit Restaurant Group, which had been trying to expand into our territory for months. They'd attempted multiple buyouts of Hartwell's locations, but the deals always collapsed due to what business journals politely called regulatory complications. I wondered how much those complications might be worth to someone who could make them disappear permanently. The next day, I called Summit's corporate offices and asked to speak with their acquisitions department. Within an hour, I was sitting across from their development director, a sharp woman named Victoria Cross, who listened to my proposition with a level of focus that made it clear she understood exactly what I was offering. "Let me make sure I understand," she said carefully. "You have documentation that could force Hartwell into federal bankruptcy and criminal prosecution, and you're willing to provide that evidence to us instead of the authorities for the right price?" I confirmed. "What did you have in mind?" $47 million, I said, the exact amount they owed in back taxes. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't laugh or call security. Instead, she asked, "Why that specific number?" "Because it's what justice costs. We negotiated for 2 hours." Victoria made calls to lawyers, executives, and people whose titles I didn't recognize. By the end of the meeting, we had an agreement. Summit would pay me $47 million for exclusive access to my father's evidence, with the understanding that they would handle the legal proceedings in whatever way served their business interests. The contract took a week to finalize. During that time, I continued working at the diner, watching Croft abuse his employees and steal their wages while completely unaware that his entire world was about to collapse. I thought about my father every day, wondering if he would approve of what I was planning. He had spent 15 years building airtight cases for the government, believing in official justice and legal procedures. But official justice hadn't helped him when he was dying alone, while his daughter begged for basic human compassion from a man who treated people as disposable. The day the payment cleared in my account, I walked into the diner for my final shift. Croft stood behind the register, counting cash drawer receipts with his usual scowl, probably calculating how much he could skim without anyone noticing. I approached him with a single piece of paper in my hand. "Croft, I need to give you something." He looked up, irritation written all over his face. "Make it quick. We're busy." I placed the document on the counter between us. It was Summit Restaurant Group's payment receipt, clearly showing a $47 million transaction for acquisition of regulatory compliance documentation regarding Hartwell Food Services tax obligations. Croft stared at the paper for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to sheer horror. "What is this?" he whispered. "That's the receipt for selling your company to your biggest competitor," I said calmly. "They bought all the evidence my father compiled about your tax evasion, wage theft, and fraud operations. Tomorrow morning, they'll present everything to federal prosecutors and offer to cooperate fully with the investigation in exchange for immunity." Croft's face drained of color. "Your father was a forensic accountant for the Treasury Department who spent years documenting every crime you committed. The government lost his files when he died, but I found them and sold them to Summit for exactly the amount you owe in back taxes." The paper trembled in Croft's hands as the full implications finally sank in. Not only was his company about to face federal prosecution, but their main competitor now owned all the evidence and could control the timing and scope of the legal proceedings to maximize their own business advantage. "You killed us," he breathed, finally understanding the magnitude of what I'd orchestrated. "No," I corrected, untying my apron one final time. "You killed yourselves. I just made sure you paid for it." I walked toward the exit, leaving Croft standing there clutching that receipt like it might spontaneously combust and take his problems with it. But I wasn't finished yet. The real beauty of my plan was just beginning to unfold. Within 6 hours, Summit's legal team had filed preliminary motions with federal court, presenting themselves as concerned competitors who discovered evidence of systematic tax fraud. They positioned themselves as civic-minded corporate citizens, helping law enforcement uncover criminal activity. The media coverage painted them as heroes, while Hartwell became the poster child for corporate corruption. By Wednesday, federal agents were conducting raids on all 17 Hartwell locations. They seized computers, financial records, and arrested 3 executives, including the regional manager who'd been Croft's direct supervisor. The man who taught Croft how to manipulate employee schedules and skim cash receipts was now facing 20 years in federal prison. But the most beautiful part was watching Croft realize that his personal liability extended far beyond losing his job. As the on-site manager who'd implemented the fraudulent practices, who'd signed the false tax documents, who'd personally stolen thousands of dollars in employee tips, he was individually responsible for felony charges that could destroy his life completely. I spent that week visiting every former Hartwell employee I could find. Penny was working double shifts at a truck stop trying to support her 2 kids after losing her health insurance when Hartwell closed. Rue had moved back in with her parents because she couldn't afford rent without the job she'd worked for 4 years. The kitchen staff were scrambling to find new positions that would hire people without warning notices or references. Meanwhile, I was quietly planning the next phase of my revenge. The $47 million sat in my account like a weapon waiting to be deployed. I could have disappeared, bought a house somewhere warm, lived comfortably for the rest of my life without ever thinking about Croft or Hartwell or any of the people who'd been casualties in this corporate war. Instead, I did something that would have made my father proud. I established the Arlo Gardner Foundation for Workers' Rights, a legal advocacy organization dedicated to helping service industry employees fight wage theft, harassment, and labor violations. Our first action was hiring every displaced Hartwell worker at salaries that reflected their actual value rather than what desperate people would accept. Penny became our operations coordinator, making more money than she'd ever imagined possible while helping other single mothers navigate employment law. Rue headed our documentation department, teaching workers how to record evidence of workplace violations. The kitchen staff formed our field investigation team, going undercover at restaurants and retail locations where employees reported suspicious practices. Within 3 months, we'd filed successful lawsuits against 12 companies in our area, recovering over $2 million in stolen wages and unpaid overtime. Workers started calling us when they faced retaliation for reporting safety violations or harassment. We became the organization that employers feared and employees trusted. But my personal attention remained focused on Croft. His legal troubles multiplied like bacteria in standing water. Federal charges for tax evasion and wire fraud, state charges for wage theft and labor violations, civil lawsuits from former employees seeking damages for stolen tips and unpaid overtime were piling up, and the legal fees alone were crushing him financially. And that was before any judgments or settlements. I made sure to attend every court hearing, sitting in the gallery where he could see me, never speaking, never engaging, just present as a silent reminder of how his own cruelty had orchestrated his downfall. His lawyer eventually filed a motion requesting that I be barred from the courtroom, claiming my presence was intimidating to his client. The judge denied the motion, noting that public trials were exactly that: public. As the criminal case progressed, more details emerged about the scope of Hartwell's fraud. They had been operating shell companies and tax havens, falsifying employee records to avoid paying benefits, and systematically stealing from workers who had no resources to fight back. The investigation revealed that over 2,000 employees had been affected across all their locations, but the government's case relied entirely on my father's evidence, which meant I became a key witness in the prosecution. Every time I testified, I made sure to mention how Croft had refused my emergency leave request when my father was dying, how he'd threatened to fire me for prioritizing family over corporate profits. The jury looked at Croft with visible disgust when they heard that story. During the civil proceedings, something interesting happened. Croft's lawyer tried to argue that his client had been following corporate policies set by higher-level executives, that he was essentially a mid-level employee who didn't understand the legal implications of his actions. I had evidence to destroy that defense too. Through my foundation's investigation, we discovered that Croft had been receiving bonuses based on how much money he could save through operational efficiencies. Every dollar he stole from employee tips, every hour of overtime he refused to pay, every benefit he managed to deny earned him personal rewards. He wasn't just following orders, he was profiting from theft. The prosecutor presented this evidence during the penalty phase, showing that Croft had received over $60,000 in bonuses for systematically stealing from workers who earned minimum wage. The judge called it particularly egregious and sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. But prison was just the beginning of his consequences. The civil judgments totaled over $300,000, effectively bankrupting him. His house was foreclosed, his car repossessed, and his retirement savings seized to pay court-ordered restitution. His wife left him before the trial ended, taking their children to another state where they could start over without the shame of his notoriety. 6 months after his sentencing, I received a letter from Croft, written in the careful handwriting of someone with too much time to think. It was partly confession, partly justification, and partly a plea for forgiveness. He wrote about growing up poor, about feeling powerless in his own life, and about how having authority over employees had made him feel important for the first time. He admitted that refusing my emergency leave had been pure spite, that he'd wanted to hurt someone the way he felt hurt by his own circumstances. The letter ended with him asking if I thought he deserved what had happened to him. I never responded. Instead, I focused on expanding the foundation's work. We opened offices in 3 neighboring states, hired employment lawyers who specialized in corporate fraud, and developed training programs that taught workers how to recognize and document violations. We partnered with investigative journalists who exposed companies that thought they could abuse employees without consequences. 2 years after Hartwell's collapse, we'd recovered over $15 million in stolen wages for workers across the region. Companies started changing their practices just to avoid being investigated by us. The mere mention of the Arlo Gardner Foundation was enough to make corporate executives review their employment policies. But the most satisfying moment came when Summit Restaurant Group contacted me about a potential problem. They'd acquired several Hartwell locations and discovered that some of the former managers had implemented similar fraudulent practices at their new jobs. These managers, trained by Croft and his superiors, were apparently incapable of operating honestly even when working for different companies. "We want to make sure our operations are completely clean," Victoria Cross explained during our meeting. "Could your foundation conduct a comprehensive audit of our employment practices?" I agreed, but with conditions. Any violations we discovered would be reported to authorities regardless of Summit's preferences. Any affected employees would receive full restitution plus damages, and Summit would implement ongoing monitoring systems to prevent future violations. Victoria accepted immediately. During our audit, we found minor violations at 3 locations, all connected to former Hartwell managers who couldn't break their habits of skimming tips and manipulating schedules. Summit fired them immediately and paid over $200,000 in restitution to affected workers. But they also did something unexpected. Victoria offered to fund an expansion of our foundation's work, providing resources to investigate corporate fraud nationwide, wanting Summit to be publicly associated with workers' rights advocacy to prove ethical business was profitable business. I accepted her proposal but insisted that our investigations remain independent, including pursuing Summit itself if they ever betrayed their commitments. 3 years after my father's death, the Arlo Gardner Foundation had become one of the most feared advocacy organizations in the country. We'd recovered over $50 million for workers, shut down dozens of fraudulent operations, and sent 23 executives to prison. I often thought about what Dad would say if he could see what his quiet, meticulous work had ultimately accomplished. He'd believed in official justice, in proper channels, in procedure. But sometimes official justice needed help finding its way. Sometimes a forensic accountant's daughter had to sell evidence to corporate competitors to make sure criminals faced consequences. Sometimes revenge required patience, strategy, and turning personal grief into systemic change that protected thousands from the same cruelty. I kept Croft's letter in my desk drawer, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of why this work mattered. His words revealed the mindset of someone who hurt others because he felt powerless, someone who chose to abuse authority instead of using it responsibly. There were thousands of other managers like Croft, other companies like Hartwell, other workers suffering silently. My father had given me the tools to fight them, and I intended to use those tools until every stolen dollar was returned, every violated law enforced, and every worker knew they had someone ready to fight for them when their employers decided profits mattered more than human dignity. Our newest investigation involved a hotel chain where housekeeping staff reported wage theft and sexual harassment, with evidence pointing to organized crime and political corruption far beyond routine violations. It would be our biggest case yet. I thought about Croft in his prison cell, still wondering how mistreating a grieving waitress had ignited his downfall. He'd asked if he deserved what happened. The answer was simple. He deserved exactly what he'd given others. I just made sure he received it with compound interest.